Good morning, everybody. Good to be here. Good to see you. Let me start with a concept, fake it till you make it. Probably heard about it. It's a strategy more or less used by any founder, I think, out there. Usually face a dilemma. Investors, they want to see results, traction, but in order to have that, you need money. So where do you start? It's kind of a vicious cycle. So you maybe don't tell the whole truth, leave some numbers out. I'd say everybody does that. Now imagine faking your way to a $10 billion valuation. That's the story of Thera, a blood testing startup founded by Elizabeth Holmes in 2003 that began its eventual downfall in 2015, I'd say, when a Wall Street Journal reporter uncovered that the devices they developed apparently didn't work. One of the employees he talked to was Erika Cheung, and she became one of the whistleblowers who eventually brought the company down. So I'm glad to have you. It's an honor that you're willing to share your story with us. And I know you're from LA. You studied at UC Berkeley. You obtained degrees in linguistics and biology. And you ended up working for Thera. Was this your first job after graduation?
This was my first position after graduation, the very first one.
How did you first hear about Thera?
I had first heard about Theranos going to a startup job fair. I had actually never heard of the company. Many people hadn't. But they were recruiting at my university, and it was funny because they had a line out the door. And there was one person kind of trying to rally people to work for the company on the campus.
And what were they offering? What was like the pitch for future employees?
So, I mean, the pitch was the vision, right? You didn't really know what was going on in the company, but you knew it was a blood diagnostic company that instead of using venous straws to run all your blood tests and blood samples, you would just use a finger stick. Mm-hmm. And what was great about this is that it was a point-of-care device. So you could essentially set up these devices anywhere. You could set them up in Walgreens. You could set them up in your own home. And instead of just getting one snapshot of what your health status is, like you typically do when you get your blood drawn, you could build sort of a dynamic storyline of what's going on inside your body. So this was really the sort of compelling storyline and vision of this company. That, you know, me being kind of a budding scientist and technologist was really attracted to. And also, it was backed by what seemed to be a very charismatic female entrepreneur who had raised an immense amount of capital to sort of build this vision and build up this company.
I know the company always used to be very secretive. I think employees weren't even allowed to put their company on LinkedIn. Yeah. So how much of that, what you're describing, was actually public, or how much were you actually learning after you started the job?
Yeah, so you didn't really know what was going on internally within the company. I think the biggest sort of like strange thing going into the company was just their board. So their board was comprised mostly of ex-politicians and some military officials. It didn't really have a biotech board, but again, this was my first job out of college. You don't really think about, oh, what is the governance of this new corporation that I'll be working for? That wasn't really what I was thinking about going in. But it wasn't until kind of my interview, which again, I was starstruck with this strong female entrepreneur, that I realized every question that I would ask her about, oh, so what is the technology we're using? You know, what are the things that we're developing? It would be like, oh, those are trade secrets. Those are trade secrets. You have to wait until you start working for the company to understand what we're doing.
So you were personally interviewed by Elizabeth Holmes?
Yes. Yeah.
Did she do this with like every
employee
candidate?
She interviewed. And at that point, we were about we were almost 300 employees.
Okay.
Yeah.
What year was that?
That was 2013.
So the company was almost 10 years old?
Yeah, it was roughly 10 years old.
Raised already heaps of money.
Yeah.
What was your first impression of Elizabeth? How would you describe her?
I mean, honestly, meeting Elizabeth Holmes is not much different than what you see in the media. Okay. She is very much so, and was very much so, Theranos at that time. And kind of the same things that you would hear about how she described the company, what she was invested in, what she wanted to do in terms of the vision of Theranos. There were all these kind of canned responses for what was going on in the company, why she was doing what she was doing, why she couldn't tell us what was actually going on within the company. But she did have a certain allure to her, right? She did have this way of kind of establishing this sort of strong presence that, again, there was like an aura too of not knowing what was happening in the company and all the good things you had in the media. So you did have this sort of starstruck nature when you were around her.
I get that. Okay. You landed the job. What were your actual daily duties? What was the job description?
Yeah, so I had no idea what job I was going into.
Okay.
I basically, I told them, you know, I'm an academic. It's basically, I decide to work for you guys or I'm getting my PhD, right? And I'm on that sort of track. So I'd prefer to do something in research and development. But honestly, I didn't apply for a specific position, just gave them the resume, started interviewing, and then I was working shortly after that. But I started off in research and development. So a lot of what I was doing was working with the proprietary Theranos machines and validating to see if that they worked and to develop sort of these blood tests. And then I was in charge of sort of taking that and integrating it into a clinical setting. And so the difference between research and development and a clinical setting is a clinical setting, you are testing real live patients and resulting out those results, you know, to those patients. And so that was kind of my role and duty, working in the laboratory and then this sort of integration into a clinical setting.
I think you have to explain that. So, I mean, they were selling a machine that you could eventually, theoretically, put into your home and have your blood tested right there, but they were also running a lab.
Yeah, so the first there are different phases to sort of the company. So the first phase was really just having you go to your doctor and say, I want, instead of getting a venous draw, a finger stick using Theranos tests. So you would go into the Theranos clinics that were opening in Walgreens. So a big pharmacy that's basically, their tagline is, you're on every street corner in America. And you would go into a Walgreens, you'd get your finger pricked, they would take it to the lab and process it, and you would get your lab results on the phone.
So like in the MVP phase or something, they're testing the technology, but not on the actual devices?
This was supposed to be live and launched. It's just, it was a different model. So eventually they wanted it to get into people's homes, but for now, to make a more exclusive distribution, we're going to just start off in Walgreens stores, which is a bit more accessible than saying having to go to the hospital or whatever else, so, supposedly.
Sure. Okay. And so you're working or checking the accuracy of the machines, and apparently wasn't all that good.
Yeah, it wasn't. So the sort of like first red flags of working within the company and sort of checking the accuracy of the devices was working in research and development. So I was working on things like vitamin D. So, you know, do you have a vitamin D deficiency? TPSA, which is to check, are you at risk for prostate cancer? And a couple other of these chemical tests, and I was noticing so much variability. So the simple way to test this is I have a known concentration of how much vitamin D is in a particular sample. And I'm basically trying to get my machine to say that it has this amount of vitamin D, right? I know what it matches. It was not matching, ever. It was all over the place. Every once in a while, it would, but there's a lot of variability. And when we were in these big lab meetings trying to discuss, you know, okay, is this a valid test? Is it accurate? Is it precise? What I was finding were people were deleting data and doctoring data to basically make the test look like they were performing much better than they were. And this was kind of a big red flag to me, where they kept saying, oh, we're getting rid of the outliers. Okay. You know, these are kind of like these exceptions. But there were starting to be so many exceptions that actually that's just the reality of the tests that are running. And also the first principle of, you know, scientific integrity and the scientific method is you don't delete the data. Yeah. The data is in itself powerful, and that is enough.
So in theory, I think the promise was to test on like 100 blood testing things, diseases. Why didn't it work? What was the technical reason behind all these failures?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, we never really had this machine, right? It didn't really exist. So that's the first sort of bottleneck. So what they decided to do was create all these other methodologies to keep their promise because they didn't have this machine built out yet. So they were, the thing is when you get your blood drawn, if you get, say, a complete blood count, that uses one scientific methodology. If you're going in for infectious disease, this has a whole nother type of scientific methodology. If you're doing things like checking your lipids or your fat within your body, that's a whole nother methodology. And these machines, if you go into a hospital, are massive. Like they're, to check your lipids, it's a machine about this big generated by Siemens. If you're doing infectious disease, it's another machine that's about this big. And what they were attempting to do was to take all these different methodologies and cram it into something about this size.
Of a printer.
Of a printer, right? And so just the physics and the kind of like engineering limitations of being able to do that at this moment, especially if you're not, say, at the cutting edge of developing technologies like that, it makes it nearly impossible. Yeah.
You mentioned the Siemens machines. I think at one point they actually started buying them and putting them in the lab.
Yeah, so again, we didn't have this device sort of built, and they felt the pressure for whatever reason to launch their products and start testing on patients. And so what they did was modified a lot of pre-existing technology to start running on patients. So like the Siemens Advia is a machine. So instead of doing a large cup sample like this, they would just 3D print their own and create it about half size. And start basically saying that, okay, well, if you just minimize the amount of sample and still use these other machines, it should be okay. Which in some cases you can do, and you can sort of modify tests that are already in existence. But it was just so extreme because they had these limitations and constraints of having this very tiny blood sample.
But I mean, the people that were working there were good, right?
Yeah.
These were good scientists, people from like all over the world, Silicon Valley insiders with a lot of experience. But the task was was impossible.
Yeah, I mean, it's a multitude of factors, right? The task, if you incrementally try and solve these problems at a small scale and say maybe not have one big device, but several small devices, there is a possibility that you can build pretty good point-of-care devices. So I think a lot of people stuck around, like, there is some hope in what we're developing, but also it's just the leadership, right? It's the organization. If you're having someone who is basically telling you, despite having 20 years experience of building devices, that you're wrong, that you're not being a team player, that you're, basically not being visionary enough or abiding by the ethos of a company, it can make it very hard to know what to do, right? So you end up just having this situation that it doesn't matter how many smart people that you shove into a room, if there's no structure, if there's no leadership, and there's no trust in these individuals with a lot of experience, you're not going to make very big gains into sort of completing a vision. So
you have a company culture where you can't really criticize the leaders, right? Can you describe a little bit what was the atmosphere in the lab and in the company?
So I think one thing is there was a lot of siloing, right? So the one sad thing is this is a very multidisciplinary task if you're trying to achieve this. So they didn't want any alarm to be raised, and so they were very secretive. They were secretive on so many levels. So externals coming in, especially so. No one could figure out what was going on in the company. Within the company, there was a lot of emphasis put on you don't say anything, you don't talk about what you're doing, like you signed an NDA, there are trade secrets here, you need to protect the sort of information that is occurring on this company. So that was definitely really indoctrinated into us. And then even there was a lot of isolating of different departments. So if you were a clinical scientist or a marketer or a computer scientist or a statistician, or even within the scientific department, there would be different, like, we isolate information. If you want to talk to this person, you have to talk to this trusted person to relay information. It was nuts, right? Like, you can't sort of have these types of dynamics when you're building these complex medical devices.
So does this mean when you're siloed off, it's difficult to actually sense that something was off? I mean, you realized this, but there were hundreds of other employees that didn't have an idea that something was wrong?
Yeah, I think, so there's, in the documentary, Tyler Schultz, who was another one of the whistleblowers, had made this very good distinction. So there was the sort of tiled world and the carpeted world.
Okay.
So the business development people, the marketing people were in this sort of carpeted world, and they really could not understand what was going on in the laboratory. The people within the laboratory, you know, there were numerous people that knew stuff was going wrong. Some departments didn't. Everyone, I think, was kind of hoping that one of the departments were working. You know, there was something that someone was getting it right. And some people
can't be all wrong.
Yeah, it can't be all wrong, right? It can't be all wrong with, again, the media hype, the partners apparently that we had, the amount of money we raised. And also, a lot of the staff was just like me. We were very inexperienced as well, at least the people who were really on the ground pushing these things forward. So we didn't kind of know any better. But yeah, a lot of people, you know, didn't, it was just so stressful, so tense, that a lot of people didn't know what to do or what was going on, and also the turnover was quite high.
Okay.
So majority of people left within a very short period of time.
You took the courage to actually talk about this. You approached the CEO, Sunny Balvani. What was this experience like?
So it was pretty illuminating. So working within the company, I had really thought, okay, there are errors, but that's why you're here. You're hired to sort of fix all these problems of what's going on. And I had really thought that just Sunny and Elizabeth didn't know what was going on, that it was so crazy in the laboratory. And so I had tried to like set up all these quality control structures, error reporting, like all these different systems. And so when I went into Sunny's office, I was really coming in there with a lot of goodwill, like there's a lot of problems going on, and I need to tell you these things because we need to think seriously about what we're doing, especially because we were processing patients at this point with this really, frankly, terrible technology. And, you know, he basically goes in there, and I go into his office and I say, you know, I really love working here. I love the vision, but there's problems. And his response is, well, what makes you qualified to say that there are problems? You need to do your job and sit and process patient samples without question. So basically from that point forward, I was like, okay, this is bad, right? Like if the COO of the company, who is supposed to be the head leader of this, is disregarding everything I'm saying, even though I'm directly saying it to him, I don't know what's going on with this company. I'm weirded out. I need to get out. I need to get out of this situation.
I think you quit right after the conversation.
I quit, yeah, that same day, so.
And with any plans to go forward, what did you think, like, I'm just closing this chapter, forget about it, or I have to do something about this?
I mean, honestly, I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to think. I knew I couldn't go to work sick to my stomach processing these patient samples that I didn't feel comfortable running on myself, my sister, my friends, my family. So I couldn't do that. Like, I just didn't have I couldn't. It wasn't going to happen. And, you know, I didn't know quite what to think, to be honest. I was a recent grad. This was my first job out of college. I had no experience really in a clinical setting. And there was a part of me that was like, well, again, maybe somewhere in that building, something is working. Yeah, I felt very terrible. I was very vocal with people that I don't think this is right. We're not telling patients when we make mistakes. We're not telling patients that we're resulting out with machines and technology that is underdeveloped, and they're basically iterating on patients live. So I became very vocal, but honestly, I didn't know quite what to do.
And I think sometime after that, you were approached by John Carreyrou, the reporter from the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
How did he find out about you?
I think at this point, because I had rallied, and within the company, I was pretty well known because I was trying to get things to work all the time. And so I sort of broke the barriers of of everything, and was quite vocal that, hey, this is not okay, this is not all right. So I think based on the other sources that they had, I was like a natural, you need to talk to this person. This person worked in the clinical setting, they saw what was going on with patients, and that's how he got into contact with me.
He called you up, he wrote you a message?
Yeah, he called me at my work, which was pretty uncomfortable, my new job that I was working at.
And were you hesitant, or you said like, oh, okay, let's talk about it?
No, I mean, I was freaked out because I didn't know. I knew I signed this NDA. Again, there was sort of this spell of fear that was cast over me from dealing with the company. But it was kind of a breath of fresh air, like, okay, you're not crazy. Like, it's not the case that you're the only one seeing this. There are other people that have these concerns and are trying to basically show people, you know, what they are seeing is not in reality what's going on, sort of behind closed doors, yeah.
Okay, so you talked to him. I think in the book he describes the setting as you were hesitant, but after you're realizing he knows a lot, you're opening up and helping out a lot. You also reported something to an agency.
Yeah.
How did this happen?
So essentially how this happened was before John's report had come out, Theranos had decided to retaliate against all former employees. So they had hired essentially private investigators to follow us. They were calling our phone all the time, trying to get us to talk to their lawyers. In my case, I had, funny enough, it's a really like funny story. I was supposed to live with Tyler Schultz in this like community house that they had, but because he was
Tyler Schultz is
also one of the
whistleblowers
whistleblowers and former employees, but because he was under so much legal threat, I couldn't live with him because he had to completely silo and separate from everyone else. So I had to last minute find a new house. So I was living with a colleague of mine, and when basically the lawyers had come over and said, hey, we're gonna sue you if you don't come and talk to us, the letter that they had written had my colleague's address. And I was flipped out because no one knew I was staying with my colleague. This was a sort of temporary living situation. So once I received this letter, I called up a lawyer and tried to figure out what to do. And they said, hey, well, you know, an option for you is to report to a regulatory agency.
Okay.
And I again, had no idea that you could do this, but almost immediately I called up the regulators and said, hey, this is what I'm seeing. What are my options? What should I do here? And they said, well, you can do it anonymously. You don't even have to put your name attached to this report. So wrote up this report, sent it over to the Center of Medicaid and Medical Services, which in the United States, that is the regulatory body that allows an organization to test patient samples. And that triggered an investigation, and post that investigation, it shut down their clinical lab and stopped them from processing patients.
Wow. They were, I mean, that's where some of us. They were actually threatening you with law by the use of a very, very well-known law firm.
Yeah.
But did they have anything against you? Were there any proofs that you were talking?
No, I don't know. Maybe
Okay.
they did. I took the approach of just saying, okay, until you have to go to court, you lawyer up and go to court. But you figure there's so many instances that you watch, I don't know, like here are people that are being paid to bring you down. You don't need to speak to them. You're under no obligation to say anything to them. And so I sort of took this code of silence of just saying, that you have no obligation to speak to these people, and in fact, you'll probably be better off because you don't want to give them any more power than they might have over you. So I have no idea. Maybe they did, but I think I did a fairly good job of being very stealth about my role in this whole thing.
Okay. Still, I mean, I imagine it a very, very stressful situation. How do you endure all of this? What made you go forward?
I mean, it's interesting. I was talking to someone about this. It's really about the principles of the situation. Once I was given and empowered with the knowledge of what to do, it was very simple. You know, for me, why I went into biotech, why I went into healthcare is because I wanted to build technologies that help patients, right? And I don't know, that's just enough for me, right? And if you, that conflict of coming to the end of my life and knowing that you didn't do anything with all these, hundreds of thousands of people that are being told that they have some sort of patient result that may or may not be true is just something I couldn't live with. So that was fairly easy. I'm not sure. I ran a lot. I did lots and lots of trail running, keep my anxiety low. But it's interesting when you're focused on sort of being aligned with the things that you valued. It's not as stressful and as difficult as you would imagine.
Interesting. At what point did you know I'm out of it? There's nothing that can harm me anymore.
Never, right?
Never.
Like you never know. The thing is like these are still very well-off and powerful people at the end of the day who lost a lot of money because of this scenario.
Sure.
And at the end of the day, like my only agenda with this was to get them to stop processing patient samples, right? So if she went on to build a medical device and whatever else with the company, I mean, that was on them. But it still is something that you're a little paranoid and cautious about, especially now because you're on the record and in front in the limelight with everything. But I think for me, what was enough was the fact that when Clea came in and said, yeah, they can't process patient samples anymore, she's barred from testing on anyone, that is when I felt the safest, like, okay.
Okay. And I mean, in the end, it all went down. Sunny Elizabeth, they face numerous charges. You moved to Hong Kong.
I did, yeah.
You stayed in tech, but worked for very different companies. On a more abstract level, do you think Thera is like an extreme outlier? Do we have some kind of fundamental problems in tech with this kind of unethical behavior?
Yeah. So I was hoping that, Theranos was just this sort of outlier, and it's definitely one of the most spectacular cases, right? The depth of the lies and the sort of drama and just intensity of the story is unlike anything majority of people have ever seen before. But really, especially when it comes to this intersection of technology with these highly regulated spaces, you're seeing a lot of these scandals kind of coming about, right? And not even that, like, you're having Uber, right? 2017 for Uber was just like a disaster between the issues with sexual harassment being really rampant, not telling people when their data privacy was breached. And even in the scenario of, healthcare and tech, we saw Ubiome recently came out because they were overcharging patients' insurers for tests and charging them for tests that they never run. So I think there is some sort of systemic issue with the process of building these tech companies.
Yeah, where does it stem from? Is it like the move fast and break things culture that we know from Facebook, for instance?
Yeah, I think it's a multitude of things, right? There's one, like running a startup is inherently stressful, right? You're trying to basically stop a plane from crashing all the time. Yeah. That's basically what you're doing. You're launching this company, it's very challenging, it's very difficult, and all you're trying to do is sort of keep it up. So those are the conditions when you're in these sort of high pressure, high intensity, survival mode instances that can really elicit a lot of these unethical situations. But also just there's this sort of like lawlessness, this idea like you're saying, where you move fast is that portion, and then the sort of break things where we are above laws, we're above regulations, we're above these institutions that are not here to stifle our innovation, but really we're there to protect people, especially the people whose voices tend to go unheard and are very vulnerable populations.
Okay, so I mean, what I find interesting, a lot of founders, they go out there and say, we want to change the world, we want to change the way we live, work, I don't know what.
Yeah.
And in the end, they disregard their impact on society, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's something about being aligned with your values and the things that you sort of preach. And there's almost and the things you market is another thing. I think this is a very common trap that technologists and entrepreneurs get in as well. They think, well, I'm not as bad as those guys over there. Like, you know, when it comes to things that are unethical, like I'm here to make a difference, make an impact. And they don't realize that, sure, you can say that, but are you actually doing that with the technology building, with the organizations that you're in, the culture that you're fostering within them? And yeah, you can kind of catch yourself in this trap of thinking you are one thing, but not being objective about what the reality of your situation is.
3 or 4 months ago, you founded an organization called Ethics in Entrepreneurship, and we're closing this session, I think, with you explaining what is the mission of it, what do you want to change, and how are you going to do to it?
Yeah, so what we were starting to realize was that there was this sort of gap in service where a lot of technologists are not kind of trained on just basic ethics. So what we were trying to facilitate and act like was the connective tissue between these tools and resources and experts to start embedding ethics into the core of these startup and technology businesses. You know, internet companies are one thing, but what you're seeing is internet starting to breach in these highly regulated spaces. And if you don't start thinking about building things that are ethical, of the impact that these things have on society, you could destroy food systems. You could completely ruin people's retirement funds. In the case of healthcare, right, you could kill people. So this was sort of the impetus of seeing this sort of gap in knowledge with these technology companies, with startups, with these sort of young founders, to start thinking about and generating these dialogues and making it a center point of their businesses, not an afterthought. Having these conversations at the very start of an organization versus, oops, I messed up, now I'm in the media and there's this big scandal, and so now we have to start thinking about this. So that was sort of the initiative and the drive to create something like this.
Cool, very interesting. I think we have some questions on Slido. I mean, there's a lot of questions, but we'll pick just a few. Let's talk about the third one. How do you think investors can avoid this trap in the future? What safeguards are best?
Yeah, I mean,
thinking about Tim Draper, for instance. This is an experienced guy.
Yeah.
What in the world? What happened?
So Tim Draper, I'm gonna leave that one out, because Tim Draper actually has a personal relationship with Elizabeth Holmes, right? His daughter was her best friend, so there may be something going on there. You know, I think in the Theranos case, a lot of the investors were sort of these high net worth individuals who, I mean, if you're trying to build a company that you feel will pay it forward to society, Theranos was a good candidate for that. But what you had was this sort of like, oh, well, this great guy like invested in this company, so it'll be okay if I invest in this. So making sure that just you ask better questions when you're making these investments, right? You dig into the product, and to get outside of your network of people and ask them, what do you think about this deal? What have you heard from other experts in the technology industry? And
so would you say traditional VCs, they would make a better due diligence?
So and when you saw with Theranos, there were some VCs that invested in Theranos, but the majority of the Silicon Valley biotech investment community passed on Theranos, right? Because they're like, there's not enough information, I wasn't able to dig into the product, so they actually did a good job in not investing in Theranos and asking the right questions.
Okay, very interesting. How many years of your life did the Theranos situation end up taking up? How many nerves?
That's a good question. So I only worked at Theranos for 7 months, which a lot of people don't realize. And then in terms of, I finished working there 7 months, and with the Wall Street Journal article with reporting to the company, it took about another year, I would say. So like a year and 7 months. But 7 months was intensely working with the company. But then the whole reporting and all that drama was probably 3-4 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, you're still occupied with it, apparently.
Yeah, exactly. Still, it's a bit bizarre that something
Thanks a lot, Erika. I think we've run out of time. Thanks a lot for attending this very interesting session.
All right,
Thank you.
Thank you.